This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Welcome to today's episode of Thrive Perspectives. This is your host, Stu, and today we're embarking on a conversation that might unsettle our assumptions and stir something deeper. In a culture obsessed with comfort, dopamine hits and curated joy, we've been sold the idea that happiness is something we can chase, hack, or buy. In fact, you might say that we live in a happiness cult. We worship happiness, and it's become our idol. But what if that chase is precisely what's making us anxious, disconnected, and spiritually thin? This isn't a call to abandon happiness. It's an invitation to reorder it. Let's join Matt and Connell as we ask, what if the good life isn't found in feeling good, but in becoming good? What if joy is not the prize, but the echo of a life lived with purpose? Connell, Matt.
Here we are again, lads.
Here we are again. These every fortnight seems to come around pretty quick these days, doesn't it?
Another deep dive. I'm keen on today. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot. So,
Matt,
let's dive in.
You're keen on every day.
Yeah.
Well, listeners, welcome to Thrive Perspectives. And in a sense, we're going to be picking up a topic today that has come out of our recent sister podcast episodes through the book of Revelation.
Which a lot of topics do come up as we work through the Bible in our Thrive Deeper episode. There's certain topics come up that we can't deal with there, but we deal with here.
And that's stuff. I think that's important because our whole perspective is to be the Christian worldview perspective. So it's like you would expect that to be happening. But Matt, there's some other things that have been feeding into this conversation today you've been experiencing over the last 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, and really what we want to talk about a little bit today is perhaps what is the biggest idol in our culture today.
So this is a big topic in the book of Revelation. It's, compromising with the world system is the big danger. So the book of Revelation is written for churches. It's written to churches, to essentially the big purpose of it. And people can go and listen to Thrive Deeper for more on this, but the big purpose of it is to warn churches against being drawn in to the world system, into the values of the world system. And actually, mostly it's about worship, to being drawn into the worship, the idolatry of the world system in its various forms. And, it's interesting because, it uses this idea of Babylon, and there's this very sort of graphic picture of like the whore of Babylon, the way that the nations compromise with her. So it's the picture there is a sexualized picture. And of course, in the first century, engagement with shrines, pagan shrines, often involved, cultic prostitution. Yeah. So it's interesting that there's a picture there of being drawn into a compromise with the world system through sort of pleasure and what perhaps makes us happy. And it's very alluring, right? Reading Revelation as it describes Babylon and how it allured people, into itself with all of these promises. And anyway, so I'm reading this I may say, in Kenya. I was doing a lot of reading and research over a couple of weeks there, and, in a community, very poor community in Kenya, and thinking about their issues. And it's interesting, you go to another culture and the pastor, there is talking about how, it's essentially kind of sort of a lot of Christian cults over there, or forms of Christianity, are essentially Christianized witch doctoring, right? So they've taken their sort of traditional tribal religions, which tend to focus around witch doctors and preoccupied with getting blessing and lifting curses and this sort of thing, and they've sort of just Christianized them. Now we would never do something like, we would. And so, it's interesting because then I was thinking, well, what in our culture is the sort of version of that? Who are the sort of witch doctors, and in what ways do we force the Christian faith into a sort of paganized form? What is our idolatry? And the thing that struck me most obviously, and there are a few things kind of flowing into this, was the pervasive obsession in our culture. I think this is sort of a kind of symptom in a way. It's a good clue to this, is the pervasive preoccupation with happiness in our culture. Now, I've been very interested in positive psychology and what people are saying about happiness. And, I've referred to that in previous episodes. But it really, a lot of things came together actually, reading Revelation, being in a different context, and thinking about our obsession with happiness. And I think this is a clue to something deeply, deeply idolatrous in our culture. And that sounds drastic, which is why we're going to talk about this today. Because what I was thinking about, what are ways in which we perhaps have adapted to our culture or imported or forced our Christian faith into a bigger cultural kind of shape? And I think a lot of us have with this one. I mean, I was quite convicted by this, really, personally. And then I thought, oh my goodness, this is a shrine that we worship at, I think, in ways perhaps that we don't necessarily identify. It's because of the sheer pervasiveness of the values of this happiness/lifestyle cult. So I just want to pull this apart because I think this is a big one. So first of all, let me sort of build this. How did we get to where we got? Now, we've done a bit of that in other episodes, so I'm just going to do a bit of summary. I'm really glad, actually, Stu, we've done, we talked about how we think the way that we do.
Yeah, well, we started right at the beginning, we talked about the pleasure and pain,
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we did, a lot of that with
which was right at the start.
The pleasure-pain trajectory and the whole, the sacred and the profane and all of that's there. It's a great foundation for that. I'd encourage listeners to go back and listen to that, as well as, the Big Ideas series that we completed just recently, how we get to where we are. Now, let me just summarize a strand of that. So essentially, we've moved from a sense in which values are transcendent. Values in some ways are objective and transcendent. This is not only in every religion, but, it's sort of original, the schools of philosophy that even influenced our culture in Greek philosophy, for example. Aristotle is the philosopher in that period that talks a lot about happiness. Now, for him, the Greek word there is eudaimonia, so it's different concept, but the idea is that there is something that we're meant to be. Now, this is a very important idea. There is something that we're meant to be that we're not yet, right? Aristotle thinks we're in potential, and there is something that we're meant to be. And the whole of life is working towards what we're meant to be. Now, medieval theologians picked up and said, look, he's right about that. And they use some of the conceptual tools. But what has changed essentially is we've lost any sense of what we're meant to be. And what we're meant to be is essentially Aristotle, he describes this as virtue, right? To pursue a virtue is something that you're meant to be. It's like the most, for him, it's the most rational way. It's a rational way of living, but it's also a way that fulfills our true nature.
So in a sense, it's like saying being your best self.
Yeah, that's right. And it means on the way you might sacrifice a lot of desires or things that you want to achieve who you should be, right? On the way. Now, that's already countercultural. Now, this was already in Plato. I know I'm talking about Greek philosophy, but I do this just to show how distinct our modern way of thinking even is from, ancient, non-biblical philosophy. And certainly, we'll talk about the theological part of this in a moment. But there are some really, I think, useful sort of conceptual tools in this Greek philosophical era. And so, for example, of course, Aristotle's influenced by Plato, and Plato had this idea of the three parts of the soul. Yep. Again, these are useful ways of thinking that, medieval theologians picked up on. And the three parts of the soul is, there's our appetites. The second part he referred to as spirit, but we might call this our ambitions, right? But there's a higher part. Now, modern thinkers talk about first and second order desires.
Yes.
So that corresponds to appetite and ambition in Aristotle. So I might have a first order desire to eat cake. That's my appetite. But I also want to be fit and look good. So that's my ambition. And the idea to move upwards for Aristotle towards what you should be, you sacrifice the lower for the higher, right? So I might sacrifice eating cake. I want that, but I'm going to sacrifice that for my ambition. Now, in our culture, we tend to stop short of that, right? That's why like this talk of first and second order desires, it stops there, right? But for Plato, there was a third order. Now, this is where the difference is. I mean, he describes that as, rationality or he has a way of talking about that. What I think is valid there is that he thinks there is even a higher realm, that to be truly human means that you sacrifice not only your appetites, but even your ambitions, right? Because in Greek culture, what pervaded Greek culture was the hero ethic, the sort of Homeric, and by that I mean, the characters like Achilles, they sacrificed what they wanted for their ambition, right? Their ambition to make a name for themselves, right? So they went and fought battles and risked their lives, right? Because they wanted to make a name, ambition. Now, Plato thinks all of that Homeric ethical stuff is very, very problematic. And he wants to lift it, a step higher. Now, I think in that, and of course, this is what Aristotle's picking up on, that he is saying, there is something that we're meant to be, and happiness is the achievement of that thing that we're meant to be. Now, to that in broad, I put it in broad terms like that.
Happiness is the achievement, or happiness is the outcome of that?
Oh, thanks, Stu. That's a good one. Well, here's the thing. That's a good question. See, because you're thinking of a psychologized happiness.
Yes, I probably am.
As a feeling, which, yes, in that sense, it's the outcome. But for Aristotle, happiness was a state of being.
Okay.
So he's using happiness in the terms of, and the Greek word is eudaimonia, which is good spirit in a sense. In demon is a spirit. So daimonia is good spirit, right? That you're in a good spiritual state. Okay, so for him, and essentially, that's the difference. It's a state of being, and so whether you feel it or not, you are in a good state of being, and you're more likely to experience good feelings, I guess, as a byproduct.
As a byproduct.
Okay. But he's not that interested. I mean, this is the interesting thing, and the reason why I bring this up in the Greek period is just to highlight differences in ways of thinking, because sometimes you inhabit another way of thinking to kind of show up or expose the deficiencies in and what's missing from our way of thinking. So now what we've talked about before is the process by which we get to a view of the human self entirely in terms of what the philosopher Charles Taylor refers to as expressive individualism. So we've gone on that journey in the past a bit. So basically, to be in the best possible state for us this is our cultural framework, right? Means that it's the realization, let me put it in popular terms, it's the realization of your dreams and desires.
Yes.
Right. And this is in the literature, in positive psychology literature. Some of the key aspects of what they say brings you happiness is you setting goals and then achieving those goals, right? Now, there's a big problem with that from a biblical point of view.
And this is where the transcendent values have also gone.
Yeah, so there's no so now that there's no transcendent values, what we do is that we
set our own values.
We essentially fall into what's known as the naturalistic fallacy, which is this idea that what is what should be. So basically, we're advocating that, right? This is the way that I am, and this is how, and actually, I need to give full expression. What I should do is give full expression to the way that I am, right? So it's the realization of the things that I desire.
Is that then because part of the definition of happiness, and just as you're talking there, I'm thinking, but I still can't figure out like what is happiness, and just thinking about this topic before.
Okay, let's move towards
today,
it. We'll move towards that, yeah.
Trying to even research that. There's so many different meanings that it's a word that we actually use we use it, and it means a whole lot of different things. And it's one of those things, it almost seems elusive. You kind of know when you're happy, but I can't tell you what happiness is.
I think it's one of the most ambiguous words in our language, because it essentially, the way that I describe, and I use the word in my book, Deeper Places, I use the word happiness and I work with it as a fairly ambiguous term that nevertheless refers to, in its general usage, the highest state of being imaginable to us. there's some state of being that I feel drawn towards.
Does that mean becoming sort of the
and we use the
version
word
of herself?
happiness?
That sounds like we become the greatest maximum version of herself.
Yeah, but not
Yes.
set on his. It's what you imagine. You'll never get there. Essentially, is what you're saying.
Well, no, I'm just talking about the usage. It's there is, and this is where let's moving on from Aristotle now and going into the Middle Ages, and I'm using these thinkers to sort of map this. We're joining a discussion here that's been going on for thousands of years, right? So, I want to be sort of conscious, a bit of conscious of that. So one of the a theologian that talked a lot about happiness is Thomas Aquinas in the late Middle Ages, and he admitted, he said, look, everyone has this base intuition of something that we're reaching for. We're all reaching for something. And let's just say happiness is it. Like, we can't not want happiness. So I think he was trying to be realistic. We all want to be happy, right? And so he uses happiness. There's a couple of different terms that he uses that I'll explain in a moment, because he thinks that we need to distinguish a couple of different senses of that. But he starts with this idea that, look, it's inevitable. He thinks you can't say to someone, don't chase don't chase happiness, because we just want happiness. However, there is a problem with making happiness the goal if we psychologize it, which we have in the modern era.
So just unpack that a little bit, just for listeners. Yeah. When you say psychologize it, just
right. Good.
Try to unpack that a little bit.
So happiness, right up until very recently, the last sort of 100 years, happiness was seen as a state of being. For Aquinas, there was two aspects of that. He distinguishes between felicity and beatitude. Felicitas and beatitudo in Latin, just in case anyone's interested, because they're both Latin words that he used to describe different aspects. Felicity is the physical and mental well-being, perhaps you could say, but what he wants to say is that actually ultimately being human, in fact, is entirely about being consumed with this desire for a higher version of happiness that he refers to beatitude. Now, that word might be familiar to a lot of Christians as referring to the Beatitudes, famous speech of Jesus in Sermon on the Mount, where he says, blessed are. It's interesting that he says, blessed are those who mourn, right? So this already shows us that the word beatitude means something from a psychologized, because mourning would seem to be the opposite to happiness, right? If I'm mourning, if I'm sad, then I'm not happy.
So it's not about getting pleasure. Well, I think, though, if you ask most people straight away what's their first answer, if you said to them, what does happiness mean to you? I think most people think about being in a state of pleasure, whatever those things are. The happiest times is when...
Yeah, state of pleasure. That's right.
Some sort of state of pleasure, when it's obviously not, because even from a non sort of biblical perspective, we sort of recognize that happiness is it's an enduring state. It's not a fleeting moment of pleasure in itself. Like, if I heard someone talking about it from a perspective of someone, say, who's got like bipolar, and they fluctuate from manic stages of, feeling
euphoria,
euphoric, and then you've got the sort of the depressive stage where you're at the lowest point. And if you were to say to someone with bipolar, what's happiness to you, they would think it's when I'm in that euphoric state. But actually, normal is in the middle. It's like having those two forces almost in balance, and it's a continual, like it's something that's enduring. It's not that you're always super excited or feeling joy overflowing, and it's not about, although you could even be, I guess you could argue, I was going to say it's not even about being always in a state of pain and suffering, but I guess there is something even in that even in the midst of pain and suffering, that you can still feel.
Well, feel, the problem is the word feel. So the problem is the word feel, the word pleasure. These are, and even in Aquinas' notion of felicity, it's actually not about pleasure. That's more what you describe as a hedonistic way of thinking about happiness. For him, it's still the Aristotelian, like felicity for him is just working with the Aristotelian model. So he's acknowledging Aristotle was right, but he refers to that as felicity. Felicity is the fulfillment of your true nature, right? So it's never about just pleasure and that's even the lower sense, right?
Yeah.
So what Matt's, just remind our listeners, what Matt's talking about there is the Aristotelian model is where you're willing to sacrifice lower desires to achieve something more.
Yeah. And that gets you to a state of felicity, a fulfillment of your being as you're meant to be, right?
Is it what I think I'm meant to be, or is it according to who?
Well, for Aristotle, of course, Aquinas as well is working with a biblical framework. It's as I'm meant to be, and a transcendent. So not who I say I am.
And this is the
no one ever. That's this kind of circular thing. Like, I decide who I am, and then I get happiness by being who I want to be. I mean, it's almost insane.
But that's where we are now, is what we're saying.
Yeah, that's where we are now, and it's certainly not working. I mean
and again, because we've lost the transcendent values, we now set our own values, which means we can't fail.
Yeah, and so even for Aquinas, that there's a sense of happiness as felicity, which is in this life realizing our true, becoming who we're meant to be. But that's not the goal. The goal is what he describes as the beatific vision, right? The goal is the supreme enjoyment of God, right? And this is taken up in the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which says the chief end of man is to enjoy God and glorify him forever, right? Enjoy the enjoyment of God. That's the beatific vision, right? So it's relational. Desire is built for that, right? And that is what, going back to our model, our double axis model that we've talked about, that's not just the horizontal movement from pain to pleasure, that's the movement from desecration to holiness to sacredness to the sublime, right? That's the beatific vision, right? So it's the enjoyment, glorify and enjoy God. So that's beatitude. That's what he refers to as beatitude. And this is what the human heart longs for. Now, what we do in our fallen state, according to Scripture, and let's get to Scripture now, we exchange things for something, right? In Romans chapter 1, and they exchanged. It's all about exchanging this for that. Readers can go and read Romans chapter 1, and the use of the word exchange there, right? They exchange the truth of God for a lie. They exchange natural relations with unnatural relations. They exchange this for that. And the exchange is one in which we try to achieve, we've closed off a realm of autonomy for ourselves. We become, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, of course, means that it's essentially assuming the right to decide for yourself
what's right and wrong.
What is right and wrong. I mean, this gets to the heart of things, doesn't it? Like this is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where I decide how I live, what's good for me, what I want, right? That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Like that is the core essence of what sin actually is, according to the Bible. So what the book of Revelation is basically saying as we move towards the end is that becomes cult proportions. Yeah. Exactly that.
Yeah.
It's our pursuit of our own version of happiness or satisfaction, which is identified in those. It's very interesting because, even there, it's somewhat counter, like Book of Revelation is somewhat counter to what even Greek philosophers are saying at the time. It's like, how could something like this ever be universally accepted? But we're in a stage now
where it is,
where actually Babylon, as it's described in the book of Revelation, is actually so descriptive of the world in which we live in, that front loads pleasure and autonomous happiness.
Yeah, and I think an individualistic happiness, as opposed
exactly.
to a communal happiness where it's not about the good of everyone, it's just about the good of me and me getting what I want and what I need. And we see that flow through every stage of society these days, I think, particularly in the Western world.
Yeah,
anyway.
and so for us, and this is the problem with the notion of happiness, because happiness is all about self-realization, right? I realize there's no transcendent source anymore. We're working within what the philosopher Charles Taylor refers as the immanent frame. That's the closed system. So there's me. And it's interesting to note, in various models of happiness in the literature in positive psychology, a lot of models of happiness have autonomy as one of the key things, a sense of autonomy. Now, often what they mean by this is controlling yourself, like I am being who I want to be. But there's no questioning. It's no it's not quite self-denial in the sense, because it's in the biblical sense, because the biblical sense is who you think you are is nothing like what you are. So you need to actually put aside everything that you think you are and everything that you want. To put it really clearly, I mean, the call of Jesus, take up your cross and follow me, is to enter a life of sacrifice, where you sacrifice in the most fundamental senses everything that you think you are. And there was a cult of identity in the first century as much as there is now, right? Everything that you're building, that you think you are, that gives you satisfaction, that makes you feel good about yourself, sacrifice it all. Be prepared to sacrifice all of these lower things. Now, and the concept of sacrifice, I mean, it's already there, in Plato, but Jesus just takes this to another level, because it's not just sacrifice to make you feel satisfied with yourself. It's a sacrifice where you are becoming completely confluent and one with God. This is the beatific vision.
Yeah. So if you take God out of that, then we see this, I think, in psychological theory today. Psychologists grapple with this, because probably most people coming to see psychologists recognize that they're deficient in some way in terms of happiness, whether they're struggling with anxieties and depression and things like that might make you feel like, I need to go and sort this out. I need to talk to someone. That's probably, I imagine, a lot of the work of psychologists, talking to people. But irrespective of that,
Well, let me. Can I just say something about it? Because I at this point I want to make a really important point, because for all of the psychologists that might be listening to this, in no way does this discredit the discipline of psychology, and I think seeing a psychologist can be an enormously important step forward for a person. So, and I think there are tools in psychology that help us self-analyze. I mean, best kind of psychology is a deep form of confession, is bringing things that lie in the dark and clarifying my thoughts and understanding my feelings and putting everything on the table. I think all of that is really enormously valid, but I think it needs to be done within a context. This is all about the context within that, so that all can be useful if it's in a discipleship context where I'm following Jesus. So the clarification of my feelings, the sorting out of my thoughts, the understanding of how my past affects me in my present, all of those things that a good psychologist will do with you, I think can be valuable in the discipleship journey. But it's all about the big picture.
Yeah, so it's a good point. And I think even starting to recognize these things is important as you start to sort of self-analyze. Even outside of the biblical framework, it can expose certain things about you that it's going to force you to really deeply question the journey of life that you're taking. But I think when you leave God out of the context or the framework, then it's interesting when you read a lot of the theory, because they all identify that happiness isn't pleasure specifically or feelings of joy. And happiness isn't something that you can chase or acquire on your own. They recognize that it's found in relationships, in having a meaning and a purpose. They even recognize the value of religion, having some sort of spiritual values and so on. No one can quite put their finger on what is it then that creates happiness. But one thing they all seem to agree on, is that you can't make happiness the goal in itself. It's a byproduct of feeling like you have purpose and meaning. And that kind of makes sense.
We'll dig into that.
But it all points to me, it's pointing to something. I've sort of reflected on it and kind of struggled with it, because it almost means that I don't want to create happiness, so therefore I'm going to go and create meaning, and I'm going to go and do things that give me a meaning and a purpose. But I know that in the back of your mind, you actually
do it so it makes me happy.
You do it to make you happy. And if pursuing that meaning and purpose doesn't make me happy, then I'll probably ditch it. And I would do the same with relationships. If it doesn't make me happy, then I'll ditch it. What is it that it seems like they're missing? Because you almost come full circle. You can't seek happiness. You should seek meaning and purpose. But really, we seek meaning and purpose in order to make ourselves happy. And you're back at square one again. It feels like there's a piece missing, even if you just look at that.
Yeah, before you jump on that, because I know you're going to get a lot to say about that, because I think this leads into this as well. I think that's part of the problem that causes, not always, but contribute significantly, I think, to anxiety and stress that we have, because in our efforts to chase happiness, we create this kind of high pressure environment where we scrutinize our feelings and then we perceive that there's a gap between our ideal and the reality, and we actually don't know what to do about that gap. And so now I'm struggling with this gap between what I think I want to be or should feel or whatever it might be and what is actually my experience.
Yeah, so we assess everything by whether it is making us happy. So is this meaningful? Well, often we assess that on whether it makes me happy or not. Yep. And the problem here, and this is where my concern is that even spiritual engagement, going to church, being a Christian can be about, I want to do this because it makes me happy. And this is where I think this is a line in the sand, and we need to, there's something there to sacrifice. Now let's go back and talk about that point that you said, Connell, about happiness as a byproduct. That is a point that is made, of course, and this is a book that I've referred to before, by Viktor Frankl, the Jewish psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, who went through Auschwitz during the Second World War. And he makes profound observations in the camps. And he observes that the biggest problem for people in the camps was not just the suffering, it was the meaninglessness of the suffering. So he makes this observation that the people that tended to survive were those who found some meaning in the midst of the suffering. So, there'd be people, because they were all starving, and, there'd be people who would just be going crazy from the starvation. There'd be other people who would go up to, this guy that's just really
struggling.
Struggling, give him his last bit of bread. Right. Frankl observes this amazing thing that's happening here. And he also observes that, all things being equal, it was the sort of people that gave that last bit of bread that survived, not the people that received it. Mm-hmm. Because those people had this sense of, they found this sense of purpose, that they're living for other people. And so he says famously in his book, and he's the one that makes the argument about happiness as a byproduct. And he says in his book, and I'll read a quote: "Happiness cannot be pursued; it must ensue. One must have a reason to be happy. Once the reason is found, however, one becomes happy automatically. As we see, a human being is not one in pursuit of happiness, but rather in search of a reason to be happy, last but not least, through actualizing the potential meaning inherent and dormant in a given situation." So he thinks that it's actually the pursuit of happiness that's the biggest obstacle to happiness. Now, there are still, it's not quite there yet. Some of those ideas, I think, from a biblical point of view, are not quite there yet, but that's a good starting point, right? That the pursuit of happiness, and there's an article in the Psychology Today magazine, the July edition.
I'll put a link at the end of the podcast.
And the title of the article is telling. The title is "The Misery of Chasing Happiness." Mm-hmm. And it recognizes that this pursuit of happiness in our culture causes misery, right? Because people look at themselves and they say, "I'm just not happy. There's something wrong with me. I'm not happy." I mean, this is so fraught with problems. Like, that expectation that we put on ourselves to be happy actually causes misery.
It's a paradox, isn't
right?
it?
Because we, and I mean, you contrast that with a biblical view that basically tells us we actually should not be happy with the way that the world is or the way that we are in this world. We should not live actually comfortably in this world. Paul says, we ourselves, in Romans chapter 8, who have the first fruits of the Spirit grown inwardly. He's talking about the struggle that we have, right? And now he talks about having joy, but our joy is in what's coming. Our joy is in Christ and what he is doing and his purpose, right? Joy in the Bible is a matter of being confluent with God. I'm going to use that idea, that way of describing what Aquinas talks about with this beatific vision, this state of beatitude is a state of union with God.
So confluent is, imagine two rivers coming and joining into one flow, basically.
Yeah, so union with God. This is something that's actually emphasized in the Eastern tradition, Eastern theological tradition, as an Eastern Orthodox, the idea of union with God as sort of the highest goal of all things. And I think it's a worthy idea, not, just pushing aside the idea of happiness. Now, what you've just said, Connell, before is that we can easily try to then do meaningful things, but still
With the goal.
Because it's always lurking in the background is the real reason I do anything.
Okay, so
let me making me happy.
Yeah, so just thinking about that, I mean, in some sense, Aquinas makes a fair point when he says it's inevitable. We're always going to want to be happy. But we need to ask, what is actually that impulse within us? What actually is that impulse, right? Now, I think we wrongly describe it. When we just describe it, we read our intuitions wrongly, I think, at times. We interpret what we want. I mean, one thing that's very evident and I think is really important for us to realize is that we don't know what we want.
No, I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Desire is a very complex thing. And one of the things that I've discovered as I've grown as a Christian is how my desires are a really bad guide. Don't ever follow your desires.
Yeah.
Follow Jesus, not your desires, right? Because I don't actually know what I want, right? I mean, I've been profoundly misled by my desires.
And the thing is, we think we do, and it's actually fake happiness that we end up with because it lasts.
Yeah, but here's the thing. If you are without God, then your desires are the most immediate thing to you, right?
Yeah.
What else is there? Now, this is the difference being a Christian. What we have the Spirit of God within us, which means, according to the biblical accounts, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel says, I will put my Spirit in you, God says through Ezekiel, and give you a new heart, right? Which means that your desires are going to become confluent, there's that word again, with God's desires, right? As in, you are going to desire with God. And that is the most, at the most fundamental level, the highest state of being is where your wanting is completely confluent with God. So Psalm 37, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. There's the order, right? Because one of the problems is that desire has become an autonomous thing. Because if it's just me, remember the meaning of life is confluence with God, is union with God, right? Relationship with God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, everything. So what that means is we're not construing desire now as an autonomous thing. This is what I desire. It's about sacrificing that for our desires to be confluent with God. So, Jesus models this as a human when he inhabits our humanity because he's doing so to model what it means to be truly human. And, there's this sense, he says, not what I will, but what you will. So as a human, he doesn't want to go through pain, right? This is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He doesn't want to go through pain. But he's modeling to us, he sacrifices what he's about. I mean, he's about to go through as bad an experience as any human ever. On a shame culture, crucifixion is about shaming. It's pulling down everything that you are, as well as the physical pain and torment. It's just on every level. It was horrific. But he is going to go through that because not my will, but your will be done. Now, of course, there's the mystery of the Trinity there, and that's because it's God in Christ who is doing this, right? So, but the point is that Jesus is calling us to the same. When he says, take up your cross and follow me, he's saying that whole autonomous notion of happiness, you actually need to sacrifice that now.
I'll just throw a little curveball in here because does that mean that Jesus isn't calling us to him because it will make us happy?
No,
that's right. But isn't that how we approach God? Do we pursue God because we think that he's the answer to making us happy?
But he, in a way, he is. If you define happiness not in the autonomous sense, so if you define it as eudaimonia more in the Aristotelian sense, that can work, right? Because that's the best, most desirable state of being. So not in a autonomous, psychologized version of me being autonomous, controlling my environment, feeling good about myself. All of those things tend to be included in sort of psychologized forms of happiness, personal autonomy, control over my environment, feeling good about myself. Now, the first thing that happens when the Holy Spirit comes in your heart is that you feel devastated by the spiritual state that you're actually in. You don't feel good about yourself. You feel shame, and shame is the distance between what you are and what you should be. Now, you don't wallow there. Jesus forgives us and we receive the love of God, right? But a core disposition of the Christian faith is a disposition of humility and penitence, like penitence, right? Which is not feeling comfortable with the way that we are, right? Mm-hmm. And not being happy with the way that we are. And yet at the same time, and this is the paradoxical thing, we have this sadness, we have this groaning, but at the same time we have this joy because we have the answer to that. I mean, still, that answer is still working its way in us, but we have this hope, In Romans 5, Paul says, suffering produces perseverance, which produces character, which produces hope. And then and hope basically he identifies as the key to Christian joy. Mm-hmm. Like we rejoice in the hope. So so those things are connected.
Paul, again, if you think this is the guy who suffered shipwrecks and beatings and imprisonment, and so he spoke of joy in suffering, not after it. So it's not like I suffered, so now I can be joyful as a result, but he spoke of it in it. And his joy, as we just said, was rooted in the purpose of proclaiming grace, building community and body in Christ, not in a destination.
Yeah.
Not because of that, but in that,
Yeah.
But do you think, though, that...
But I think your point about Christianity, because I think there's a really important point there.
Yeah.
I think perhaps, and when I say we, I'm not talking about we specifically, but I think the Western Christian church can sometimes present Christianity as the answer to happiness. And the challenge with that is your definition of happiness, or as a pastor, is different to the world's definition of happiness. And those people hear that happiness, they hear the world's definition of happiness. Oh, I'm going to get all my dreams answered. I'm going to...
Yeah, and we need this is the thing, as a preacher, you have to understand that you're functioning within a cultural context.
Exactly, of course you are.
So...
But that's where the discipleship needs to kick off.
Exactly.
From that point,
And
exactly. I think that's where we, perhaps, again, we generally, I'm generalizing here, I'm sure many churches do this really well, but we think the job's done at the decision to follow Christ when actually that's when the job begins.
Let me give you an example of where I think this affects us, because we still persist in using phrases like, well, I just want to be happy.
Yeah.
And I just want my children to be happy. And, that this person deserves a chance at happiness. Right? One of my kids said to me recently, but Dad, don't you just want me to be happy? And without hesitating, I said, no, of course not. I said, I want you to live a fruitful and purposeful life. I want you to walk in the pathway that God has for you.
Yeah.
And that's not going to make you happy, but you will be fruitful. You will be purposeful. I want you to be who God has created you.
It may make you happy, though. I think, again, happiness is a possible.
Yeah.
It's a problematic word because the Bible uses the word like blessed or...
Yeah, blessed are you. Yeah, that's right.
Or delight. You delight in God. It's not using it. It doesn't.
Well, there's lots of positive. Yeah,
it doesn't say happiness. Happiness is a very.
Let's talk about positive emotion. Yeah. I think positive emotion is advocated in the Bible, right? I mean, jubilance and, that's fine. And in fact, there's a sense in which, as Paul reflects on the hope of glory, there's positive emotion there, right? Rejoice in the Lord always. I think he wants us. He wants to plug our emotional life into our hope, right? Not into our present circumstances, because on the one hand, there's a sense in which we're not meant to like the way that we are and the way that we're not meant to like it. And this idea of creating an environment for myself so that I do like it, so that I feel happy here, and this is the great Australian lifestyle cult, this kind of, what do we mean when we say, I just want my children to be happy, what they have a job that they like, that they have a nice house, that they have the things that they want, really? Is that really what we want?
So then is happiness, even talking about happiness is almost like a lower level then of almost like a worldly emotive thing, where I think if the Bible talks about these positive things like hope, being blessed, delight in the Lord, they're like quite transcendent ideas that sit way above happy.
Yeah, well, we're just talking about words here. Words are just.
Words are
just defined by usage.
But it helps me in a way think of it that I don't have to think, am I happy?
Well, that's a stumbling block, I think.
Because maybe happiness is more just I'm content, accepting.
Yeah.
If things are hard and difficult, I accept it. And if I don't have all the things that I see other people have got, I don't kind of pursue them or feel jealous and so on. So it's like an acceptance that this is what God's given me, and I'm going to live in that. And maybe that's a form of happiness, but to me, it's almost like stoicism. Like it's just getting yourself into some kind of mental state where you kind of just, whatever comes along, you've got a way of kind of deflecting it by having a stoic attitude. But I think what the Bible calls us to is something that isn't defined in those terms. We may feel accepting of whatever the circumstances are that we live in now, whatever pain. We'll have moments of joy and pleasure, and we can just be deep in the despair of pain.
Those forms, I mean, you referred to stoicism. There are different forms of that are very popular again in our culture. I mean, all the books on stoicism. I was just in a bookshop yesterday, and books on stoicism for today. And I mean, the other similar worldview is Buddhism, which is the idea of detachment, of being somewhat impervious to the world around you. Now, that really contrasts with a biblical worldview that says, no, we should be disturbed, actually. We should be sad about the way that the world is.
So just mindful of time, and I feel like it'd be good to talk about some really the things today in our world and I think what stops us being disturbed, and you've used this term before, is these kind of cultural anesthetics that we apply, the consumerism, the instant gratification thing that actually just hide this discontent we should have with the world.
As I've grown, and there's been an interesting effect that growth for me has had, because I have, and I want to emphasize this in the light of everything that we've said, I have experienced a joy where I feel like I've got one foot in heaven. I mean, I just like, and this is where words fail me. And in fact, Paul speaks about the peace that surpasses all understanding, and he talks about the inexpressible joy. And I sort of get it because it's inexpressible, and it's so connected with a sense of being confluent with God. Like it's like everything, this sense of fulfillment in the highest sense of that word. My whole being is fulfilled by becoming confluent with God. And this sense of joy in that is beyond any psychological factor. I mean, of course there's a psychological element to that, and often it brings like tears of joy, and there is emotion connected with that. But here's the interesting thing. At the same time, it's actually seeded within me at the same time a very, very deep sadness, a deep discomfort in the state that I'm in the broken state that I'm in what I see in my heart, and what in the world that we live in. Like it seeds this, and it's what Paul talks about, I think. I mean, this is why, don't follow your feelings. I interpret my experiences in the light of Scripture. For me, it's important to look at Scripture and to say, no, this is valid, actually, this experience. I'm going to embrace this sadness. I'm not going to try and get rid of it and cheer myself up. Because Jesus was a man of sorrows, right? Because he came into this world in the state that it is, to a humanity that he loves. I mean, there are moments of great joy, right? And he has great joy in God, yet he's a man of sorrows. And I think fundamentally, the experience of the Spirit-filled life is an experience of transcendent joy, but the flip side of that is a deep sadness that compels us to not accept the world the way that it is, to point people urgently to the joy of God. It's the angel in Revelation, saying about Babylon has fallen, come out of her, my people. And don't withdraw from the world. We're meant to be involved in it, right? We're meant to contribute towards the peace and the prosperity of the city, as Jeremiah says in Jeremiah chapter 25 in his letter to the exiles
in Babylon.
And we talked about that in the last episode, right? But there should be a level of discomfort that we have. And so my encouragement to you is allow yourself to feel your sadness. If you find yourself, allow yourself to feel yourself and let it take you to God. Let that take you to God, where you will find joy, right? But it's a joy that is beyond what we generally refer to when we talk about happiness. And in a way, I'm not saying it's not right to use the word happiness. It's just in our cultural context, it's been defiled by usage. And so I'm less and less comfortable with that, which is why I prefer using the biblical word joy, because I think joy can sit with sorrow. The opposite to happiness in our culture tends to be sadness. But I think sadness has an important role in our life. Psalm 126, those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. So, I think...
man, I just want to say, I feel like one of the big challenges in our culture is that we're actually desensitized to feel that sorrow. We come to church and we're all happy and we drive out of the driveway. I'm generalizing again, and we don't think about the cars driving past who don't know Jesus. It's like Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem, and yet we just go about our lives and we've become desensitized to the injustice in the world, to the suffering in the world.
And I mean, even in Christian culture, we can always be trying to cheer ourselves up. I mean, even when someone dies, we've got to cheer, but if they're going to a better place, and all that's fine. But look at how Jesus responded.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus, who in the same chapter, John chapter 11, talks about himself being the resurrection and the life. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, right? Because death is a tragedy, right? We need to be okay with inhabiting sadness, because I believe it can lead us, it wrenches us away from a love of this world, a connectedness with the world system, getting back to the Revelation context. And it drives us to God, to a confluence with God that is the source of our joy. And the pathway to joy, there are a whole lot of acts of sacrifice. And I think one of the most important acts of sacrifice is we have to sacrifice this pursuit of happiness and almost allow ourselves to feel, could we say, the sadness of God, the grief of the Holy Spirit. And I think there's something starting there. I think we can move towards, and even at the same time, have this profound sense of biblical joy. I know there's a lot to think about there today. And I'd encourage listeners to pray about this. And because this is actually, I want to come back to this idea. I believe there's a deeply embedded idolatry that I think I've found in myself, and I believe is even in a lot of Christians. I mean, we tend to determine values on the happiness principle and whether people have a chance to be happy. And I just think we've gotten totally skewed by this in deeper ways than we even imagine. So there's a lot to reflect on there, but I think most importantly, a lot for us to pray about and ask God, in what ways have I compromised? Like, ask God to awaken in your heart, to cut through the anesthetics and to enable you to feel what He feels about yourself and the world around you, and see how that awakens not only the sadness of God within your heart, but the joy of God.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.